We're live.
Okay, we are live. It's the Senate Education Committee back after a short break. And we're going to now switch gears again and spend a little time taking our first look at S15. We have a few witnesses lined up. And we are starting with Doreen Wolfman. So on S15.
Hi.
So were you here when we all introduced ourselves before?
We were not here that early to hear you all.
Okay. So we'll do a quick round of introductions for us as we start S15.
Oh, that was it. Okay. Senator Keisha still chitting now.
Nader Hashim, Wyndham County.
Dave Weeks, Rutland County.
Seth Barnhart, Bennington Senate District.
Terry Williams, Rutland County.
Steve Heffernan, Edison.
And then you introduce yourself for the record.
My name is Doreen Dorfman, and I live in Plainfield, Vermont.
Okay.
May I begin?
Yes.
And I have served as a teacher and principal in Vermont schools for nearly 30 years. In 2021, after earning a master's degree to become an educational specialist in language literacy science, I left school administration, where I'd been a teacher and principal many years. I left school administration to teach evidence-aligned reading and writing to students in grades 5 through 8 at Barrytown Middle and Elementary School. I made this decision after witnessing the school failure, behavioral problems, mental health issues, and truancy among middle and high school students struggling in literacy, most of whom had not been identified with a disability, but nevertheless needed effective supplementary instruction by knowledgeable, trained professional educators. I needed to become that educator. Today, I present to you as a private citizen and not as a representative of my school or any organization. This testimony is in support of Senate Bill 15, an act relating to providing supplemental reading instruction in all schools. This is a small bill, akin to a technical correction, and one that can greatly improve student reading outcomes. How did we get here? Last May, the Vermont legislature passed into law an evidence-based reading bill, Act 139, relating to supporting Vermont's young readers through evidence-based literacy instruction. This has ushered in long-needed change from leadership at the Agency of Education and teacher professional development to school-wide screening assessments and classroom instruction. As often happens in the legislature, two competing bills required reconciliation in a conference committee where proceedings are closed to the public. This resulted in a complete surprise, changing a long-standing Vermont state statute, 16 VSA 2903, preventing early school failure reading instruction. Before Act 139, the law stated that a school shall provide, and it's just helpful because I'm going to do a lot of technical reading. I'm on page 2 where you can see the highlights. Okay, it's just because I'm going to be doing a lot of technical talk. I apologize. A school shall provide 1, supplementary reading instruction to any enrolled student in grade 4 whose reading proficiency falls below 3rd grade reading expectations as defined under subdivision 164.9 that's titled Proficiency Standards for the Student's Grade Level or whose reading proficiency prevents progress in school. 2, supplemental reading instruction to any enrolled student in grades 5 through 12 whose reading proficiency creates a barrier to the student's success in school. Our statute had prioritized grade 4 and made the provision for students in grades 5 through 12 to receive supplemental reading instruction if below proficient. However, Act 139 changed this section to only include schools that teach students in grades 1, 2, or 3. The language pertaining to supplemental reading instruction in grades 4 through 12 was replaced with the limiting term of such schools, as shown below on page 3. C, reading instruction. A public school or approved independent school that is eligible to receive public tuition that offers instruction in grades kindergarten 1, 2, or 3 shall provide systematic and explicit evidence-based reading instruction to all students. Here we go. In addition, such schools shall provide supplemental reading instruction to any enrolled student whose reading proficiency falls below proficiency standards for the student's grade level or whose reading proficiency prevents progress in school. The term such schools has been interpreted by legal counsel to mean only schools with K through 3 students. This means struggling readers in grades 4 through 12 shall have access to supplemental instruction in the general education program only if their school also houses grades K, 1, 2, or 3. Struggling readers who attend middle and high school no longer have the right to foundational reading instruction in general education. This is not just an enormous inequity between the supplemental instruction schools provide, but even within districts that include schools with different grade configurations. Vermont's passage of Act 139 was both long overdue and behind other states. The law aligns with reading research, stating, all students need to receive systematic and explicit evidence-based reading instruction in the early grades from a teacher who is skilled in teaching the foundational components of reading, including phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Students who require intensive supplemental instruction tailored to the unique difficulties encountered shall be provided those additional supports by an appropriately trained education professional. Unfortunately, right now, that supplemental instruction is only available to grades K-3 and to a very limited number of students in grades 4-12. So where do we go from here? I do not believe that any Vermont legislator knowingly voted to abolish supplemental reading instruction in grades 4 through 12 in schools that don't have K-3 students. Yet this is the effect of current language in Vermont reading law. Senate Bill 15 makes a small change to restore the previous language that was on the books for many years. If passed, 16 VSA 2903, preventing early school failure reading instruction, would be amended to read, C, reading instruction, a public school or approved independent school that is eligible to receive public tuition that offers instruction in grades 1, 2, or 3 shall provide systematic and explicit evidence-based reading instruction to all students. In addition, all public schools and approved independent schools that are eligible to receive public tuition shall provide supplemental reading instruction to any enrolled student. There we go, the 412, everyone, whose reading proficiency falls below proficiency standards for the student's grade level, or whose reading proficiency prevents progress in school. S15 will restore the prior language strengthened by the positive impact of Act 139. The people of Vermont have committed to students receiving evidence-based reading instruction and supplemental intervention. I see that in the schools. So they can all access challenging opportunities in all subjects to pursue higher education options of their choice, to thrive in promising careers, and achieve their dreams of lifelong learning. Passing Senate Bill 15 into law is a minor adjustment, more like a technical correction, to restore equity across our schools and help more students learn to read well. Thank you for your consideration and dedication to the success of Vermont's children. Included in the packet, you have 2 appendices. One shares the performance of Vermont 4th and 8th graders on the 2024 NAEP reading assessment, just came out the last couple of weeks. But unfortunately, Vermont children have declined even further in reading. The other is the testimony I gave a year ago that explains why our state needed a literacy law grounded in reading science. Thank you.
Questions?
Does anyone oppose this?
No,
No,
can we just move on?
Yeah, we done. Sorry,
Yeah, I think we need to hear a range of testimony. I think there'll be some,
there will be.
there's a range of testimony. Yeah,
Okay.
so.
Do you know of the opposition, or would you like to address the opposition to it? Are you aware of it?
I don't think I can represent the voices of those who oppose it. So I'm not sure how they
Okay.
go about answering that question. Okay. Fair enough.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Cindy.
We had allocated half an hour for the student to move because we're.
We will.
Oh,
Yeah.
Get your half hour.
No, you're,
Yeah.
that's good.
Thank you for taking testimony on S15 and act relating to providing supplemental reading instruction in all schools. Though I am a member of the Advisory Council on Literacy, I am not here representing the council. I am speaking with myself. And I came in and talked earlier last year when we were discussing this law. I was really pleased that you passed this with 39. For the record, I am Cynthia Gardner-Morse. I'm here because I'm a concerned citizen. I'm a parent of 3 well-educated, gainfully employed, tax-paying people with dyslexia. I live in Calais, where I grew up, in an 1850s farmhouse that was built by my ancestors. And then I went to one-room schools in Calais, and then I attended B32 High School, which opened in time for my freshman year, Chicagoland. I trained at UVM to become a teacher, and frustrated when my Cabot first graders struggled to learn to read, I was fortunate to attend Harvard's Master's in Education program, where I studied reading science. I followed the testimony that resulted in Act 139 very closely. I was surprised and puzzled to learn that the new literacy law had changed Section 2903 to include some, but not all, older struggling readers from receiving services. As a literacy tutor, I have worked with many middle schoolers and adolescents who struggle to read. Almost always, my tutoring help is sought because a student is acting out in school or at home. Once our tutoring begins to improve the student's reading skills, behaviors improve as well. Reading is an absolutely fundamental skill in our literate society. Students who cannot read well are 6 times more likely to drop out of high school. 85% of youth in the juvenile court system are functionally illiterate. These students struggle with low self-esteem, emotional and social issues, and face not only much reduced educational and career opportunities, but poorer health outcomes. Act 139 is bringing evidence-based instruction and assessment to Vermont's elementary schools. It requires parental notification when children are significantly below grade level. However, the specific language of Act 139 has created confusion for schools. Act 139 modified the previous wording in 16 VSA Section 2903 that provided supplemental reading instruction for students at any grade level before we passed this act. The question about the supplementary instruction for struggling readers in upper grades arose at the September 2024 meeting of the Vermont Advisory Council on Literacy. Council members interpreted the phrase such schools differently. Did this include just schools with grades K1, 2, or 3, or schools with all grade configurations? When legal counsel determined that such schools referred to schools with grades K through 3, this meant that under Act 139, struggling readers in schools without grades K through 3 are not guaranteed the right to reading instruction and general education. Before this Literacy Council discussion, I never questioned whether Act 139 covered all students or was limited to certain grade levels. This ambiguity was brought to the attention of the Vermont Agency of Education, among others, including Senator Martine Bullock, who introduced this here earlier, who then worked with Legislative Council to draft S15. On February 6th, Senator Bullock introduced this critical bill to eliminate the inequity and unfairness for struggling readers in grades 4 through 12 who don't attend K through 3 school, and to restore the prior intent to Section 2903, I'll call it. She clarified the intent that the intent of Act 139 was to bring the science of reading into schools by screening students in kindergarten through 3rd grade, while also making sure that everyone was getting the supports that they need, regardless of where they are in school. Senators Williams and Senator Weeks, who were both on the Senate Education Committee last year, agreed that this was indeed the intent of S204, which became Act 139. Weakening existing education laws already on the books was never intended, yet that is the result of the wording change. Last December, I consulted as an AOE staff member involved in Act 139, the new Read Vermont initiative, which is they're helping around the state. The employee stated, "We certainly are in agreement about the importance of supporting older readers, especially those whose proficiency falls below grade level and need additional supports. Ensuring that all students have the support they need is a top priority." AOE leadership has shown its commitment under Act 139 to improve literacy instruction K through 12. They've invested staff and professional resources on K through 3 training while making sure that teacher training and support includes grades K through 12. AOE's actions are in line with the legislative intent of Act 139. Restoring the intent of Section 2903 by passing S15 makes legal sense. Why not just wait and see how Act 139 works? I think this is what the opposition is going to say. Senator Hinsdale. If this discrepancy of access to supplemental reading instruction remains in Vermont statute, we are leaving schools and the state open to a lawsuit. This inequity can be found even within supervisory unions where there are K through 6, K through 8, and K through 12 schools, such as the Greater Rutland County Supervisory Union. I hope the Vermont legislature will promptly pass S15 into law, and it'll take effect immediately on passing. S15 is a minor language change that will make a big impact on student learning. Instead of limiting intervention to schools serving grades K through 3, all public and approved independent schools will be included in this provision. All Vermont students not yet proficient in reading would receive evidence-aligned intervention to become proficient readers. So in our Literacy Council, we have a high school student representative. And if he attended pre-K through 12 in West Rutland School, he would be eligible for services where he has struggling students. But because he goes to a school in a district that doesn't have that, like 232 doesn't have that, it's saying 6 through 12 high school, he would not receive those services. This creates an inequity, and passing it 15 will change that. I hope you'll not wait and see what happens, but we'll pass it soon.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have Elise
Okay.
already
Okay.
queued up, so.
good.
Elise Parambo, Richford. Elise, can you hear us?
I can. I just want to make sure I know that we're tight on time and you let us know. It's just a half hour. So I just want to check in to make sure I
Okay.
have enough time for the next speaker.
You're okay.
And the speaker following you is only about 3 minutes. I'm reading his presentation.
Perfect. So as Doreen had said, my name is Elise Parambo. I live in Richford, Vermont, and I'm really coming to you because I want to speak to you as the voice of a parent of a child really struggling with literacy. And just from what I can see from my own personal experience, how deeply this little literacy change in the law can make a huge difference for families and for kids in Vermont. My son goes to Enosburg Middle School. He is diagnosed with dyslexia. And when we first ran into problems, we had a child that was going to school and hated kindergarten. I had never met a child who hated kindergarten. He struggled. And then at the end of first grade, we were called in the school for a meeting saying that there might be an issue. And that is only because the first grade teacher brought it up. If the first grade teacher had not brought it up, we would not be meeting there, because what parents are told is kids sometimes take longer to read. Just be patient. Maybe he's not interested in what he's reading. Maybe he has eye issues. We were checking all these things out. But at that meeting, what kind of moved things forward was I also have dyslexia. And when I brought that up, the research started happening with our child. But the concern that I have most of all as a parent, if I had not known I had dyslexia or brought that to the table, my child would not be having the services in the search starting for him at the end of first grade. So really his services started in second grade. This is very common. There's this wait and see approach for kids. But as you know, from the facts that Doreen was sharing, children that receive intervention in literacy, kindergarten through second grade, close the gap much faster. But then the kids third grade on, that gap is harder to close. They need more intervention. The structured literacy will work for those kids, but without it, their self-esteem is crashing. And I can speak to that personally. I watched my son come home and talk poorly about himself and feel bad. He has an IQ that's very high, and he was feeling miserable in his peers, not able to do what they could do, quieting down. And as a parent, there's nothing scarier than watching your child crawl into themselves and disappear. And especially knowing the challenges of having an illiterate child. As a parent, I was looking at my child. He was in 6th grade, going into 6th grade with a second grade reading level, thinking, what is the future for my child? And the scariest statistics out there for illiterate children, as you heard, many of them are giving up school. Many of them are very upset, higher chances of suicide. Many of them are on the track that they're going to just walk away. They're not going to have many great opportunities in the future As we know, we live in a literate society. And then the scariest factor out there is the highest percentage of illiterate folks in one place is prison. And the highest rate of going back to prison, the statistics I found this morning was 80% of the people who are reincarcerated are illiterate. So as a parent looking at that world in front of me for my child, and these are the statistics, it is a very, very scary outcome. And I had the privilege to go to graduate school. I really advocated hard. I've met many parents who don't have the same background as me, did not understand the system as quickly or know which steps to take. I've been very lucky to meet some right people who helped show me which things my child needed. And one thing that has kind of been on the block too is this understanding or misconception that if a child is struggling to read and they haven't had intervention or structured literacy at a certain point in the early years, they're not going to become readers. I am sitting here today as a parent who is much more relieved because for the last 2 years, we have worked very closely with a structured literacy tutor, and my son is now reading at grade level. And this is a game changer for us. This shows us that there is a future coming for our child. And every child in Vermont should have that same opportunity to feel a future. And if we're taking away intervention for kids 3rd grade and up, we are signing them up for a really rough future. And are they becoming future folks that are helping the state of Vermont and helping things move forward? It's really a disservice. And it's a disservice to the parents that might not know the help that their kid needs. And as a parent, I didn't have the skills to help tutor my child or help them move forward. We really do need these experts and educators with the structured literacy skills. So I just want to thank you so much for giving me a moment to just share my own personal experience. So thank you.
It's very compelling and very helpful. It's always helpful to hear from an individual going. So that was very helpful. So questions? No, but it was helpful.
And I do have one more thing. I just want to add that for really integrated programs for children as they get older to get that help, it's private school options. And the only private schools that are around are starting at $70,000 to $80,000 for students. And just what is the reality of that for a parent? And I have to say, we sat looking at those numbers for a long time and just seeing that wall and realizing that's not a reality for our family. And that frustration of what do we do with a child that needs this extra support? And so I hope that this bill is amended so that support's just naturally built in the schools for all the children.
Thank you. One more person.
Yes, it's very quick. I'm sorry that Kenneth Caddo, author of Gather, co-principal of Oxbow Oxbow High School, could not be here. He wrote testimony. It's in your packet, and I offered to read it aloud. Dear members of the Senate Education Committee, I wish to express my support for S15, an act relating to providing supplemental reading instruction in all schools. I'm sure you will hear plenty of numbers. I'll share a few, but mostly I wish to share a single experience, an N of 1, that is representative of the many students who would be served by the passage of S15. I will call the student Joe. Our high school predictably receives students from 4 middle schools, often more, and from even more elementary schools. These students come to us at all levels of reading, from a variety of reading programs, some that embrace the science of reading and others that are only beginning to implement these practices. We are fortunate to have a passionate reading interventionist on our staff to support our struggling readers, but the passion wasn't enough. In the past 2 years, our interventionist has embraced the sound, thorough practices in the science of reading. She has gone out of her way to enroll in many professional development opportunities, from one-day seminars to credit-bearing courses. As a result, the effects of her work with our readers have become markedly more positive. excuse me. Joe came to our school as a freshman who was reading at a lower elementary school level. This resulted in poor grades throughout all his classes. Poor reading comprehension led to a disaffection for school, poor attention while in class, marginal attendance, and a large number of behavior referrals. Joe's struggles in math were primarily due to his inability to interpret the written problems, not because of math aptitude. Joe, to no one's surprise, would like to attend our career center. As tech centers lose their stigma, which is a good thing, they are becoming more competitive. They often have more applicants than they can take. Acceptance is usually based on a variety of criteria, including attendance, behavior, and grades. Joe's numbers on these fronts would not work in his benefit for the program he most aspires to attend. And we want Joe to get in. For a year and a half now, Joe has been receiving additional support outside of class from our reading interventionist, who herself is more and more effective and studied in her work. In a meeting that took place this month, Joe's teachers reported that his comprehension has skyrocketed. I can bear witness to the fact that the last time Joe was in my office, it was for something positive. His attendance has improved. Joe's grades are much better. To my mind, Joe stands a very good and fair chance of getting the future he wants for himself. This isn't due just to maturity. It's due to our school deepening our understanding of the science of reading and the implementation of better and better practices. Every student deserves this opportunity, and I'm pleased to say that our school is in a place to offer it to Joe and many others. But this kind of support for our struggling readers shouldn't be left to chance. It should be a given that our public schools are using the latest and most effective strategies. Please cast your vote in support of S15. Very respectfully, Kenneth M. Pato. Thank you.
I can just say I live that.
Me too.
So that's good. I like it.
I'm glad you're able to get the help that you need, and I hope that we'll be able to do that for all of us. There are so many students in Vermont who don't read well, and Act 139 is helping. And I just feel so badly that there was this little word change, such schools, that I couldn't believe it when I read that and heard that interpretation back from the Agency of Ed Council, legal counsel. I'm sure that wasn't intended. It's not. So good. Sounds like your folks are in favor of this. Do you have any other questions for us?
That was helpful testimony. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for moving so quickly on this. And time is always of the essence in the legislative process.
So we will take a break. And we will slide straight into the next part.
Did everybody else opt out?
No, I'm gonna check out now. Okay.
So just for the record, people watching from afar, what it's doing is just spending the next
Now, I know.
Don't worry. Keep things moving.
the next amount of time getting from some of the players or people who were involved in this, just giving some reaction to the governor's plan and the secretary's plan as far as we understand it at this point. There'll be a lot more discussion, obviously. But so that's what we're here for.
Great.
Some initial. So you've been here while we introduced ourselves.
Yeah, I was in a joint committee with House Ed earlier where
Okay.
you
So,
probably met me for the first time and, but I can do a quick introduction.
we'll just do your own. We won't introduce ourselves again. You introduce yourself for the record and off we go.
Great, thank you. My name is John Cathell. I'm the executive director for the Vermont Rural Education Collaborative. So I think there's a information card going around to just give you a sense of who we are. And with me also is Jessica Carolus. Jess is doing some work for VREC. And I know there sounded like there were some questions around community schools earlier. If you want to talk about community schools, we would be happy to. I know that wasn't on the docket, but 8 of the 11 no, 6 of the 11 community schools recipients in the state are part of the collaborative that we support. Of course, Jess administered those programs at the agency before leaving, and now working with VREP to support that in our region. So happy to talk about that maybe another time if today doesn't fit. So if you want to hear about governance and the governor's proposal, right?
Yeah, just a high level reaction at this point to help us get.
Yep, we'll give you a high level reaction for sure.
Yeah.
It's what I feel is the bigger picture that we're all trying to figure out is managing freedom and unity, right? So if you think of our state motto and how do we balance the tension between state level authority and control versus local authority and control. And I think there's been a tension forever about that. And I think we've seen times where things have shifted towards the state level to make certain decisions. And there's some good to that. There's things like education quality standards, district quality standards that are on the horizon. There are things that are necessary to ensure equity and consistency around practices. However, we've also had a very strong history of local decision-making, local voting, which I think is really part of the reason we have strong support for public education. And I think as we move forward, we have to think of that tension and that balance. What I would say is my first reaction to the governor's proposal around governance, and particularly the 5 districts, is entirely out of scale, right? We would have fewer school board members than we have members in the legislature, right? So if you think about that parallel, you know, we have a wonderful citizen legislature and we have a wonderful, public schools with citizen board members, and we would be eliminating most of that to go to 5-member and 5 districts. If the scale is entirely out of question. What I can tell you that as a former superintendent, I was a superintendent in 2 locations, Rutland Northeast Supervisory Union for 5 years, North Country for 8 years. People are skeptical of central office, right? I, as a principal, was skeptical of central office, right? And when I became the superintendent, I said to my staff, I said, listen, I never listened to the superintendent, so I don't expect you to listen to me, right? What I meant by that is from a compliance standpoint, from a directive standpoint, it's really more about bringing people together to make common decisions. It's about leading a group of people. And I can tell you that local community members really have a hard time understanding how central offices or central bureaucracies work. They tend to trust their local school boards, right? And we saw that data last spring. You had 83% of school districts that were individual districts, right, and supervisory unions that passed their budgets. 38% of merged districts didn't pass their budgets. The only district in North Country Supervisory Union that I was former superintendent, and I lived there for a number of years. The only budget that did not pass was Holland, right? I'm the board chair for Holland. Holland is a non-operating district, and that's the reason why we didn't pass the budget. We were so close to the dollar yield, right? So even when we brought back a second budget, I said, folks, we can't spend less money because you're collecting this money. It's going to Montpelier. This is the least you can do, right? And so, but the reason they didn't pass a budget is because they had no connection to their school. All right. It's a wonderful community. I've grown up in that community and I, believe in my community, but it's hard when you tuition your students out. And it's a very reasonable tuition rate to the Derby Elementary School, 1 designated school, and it works. That school district closed. The school that I went to as a child, right, that I was once the teaching principal at, closed while I was superintendent of schools. So there are communities that will make the decision. It wasn't my choice. It was my community's choice. My job was to give them an objective process to help guide them through that process and for them to make a decision. But even though they don't have a school anymore, they're still concerned about taxes, right? Like everybody else. What I would say is that the further we remove people from the process of making decisions around their schools, the less public trust we're going to have for public education.
Can I just ask what happened to the school? Is that
It's we're not operating district. School doesn't operate anymore.
did it turn into something else?
That's a great question, right? So I worked with a group of people. We created a nonprofit organization, the Community Center. It's been 5 years since the school's closed. It's not easy to create a community center in the middle of a pandemic, right? So that's when we started. So we didn't get as much traction. I'm no longer on that board because I'm now on the school board. But they have a community center. The building gets utilized somewhat. And we are in the process right now town meeting. We hope the community will vote to transfer ownership of the school to the town. It's really, at this point, it makes sense. We're not going to open the school. We did a mock budget this year and showed people that with, even though we've gone from 33 students when the school closed to about 54 students, it still wouldn't necessarily be economical for us to reopen the school. You know, not only the increased cost of operating the school, but replenishing everything. There's no computers, there's no books, there's no tables, or minimal tables and chairs and things like that. So the school's not going to reopen. So we're working on transferring the school. So my concerns are scale. I just think it's entirely out of scale for the context of Vermont. I think Vermonters want to be connected to their communities and their community schools and make those decisions. I think one of the things that has not been really considered is there's often a diseconomy of scale. Right. And we proved this in North Country when I was superintendent there. Under the law, we were supposed to consolidate transportation. We conducted an entire study and proved that if we consolidated it entirely ourselves, our cost would be about $300,000 to $400,000 more. And we went out to bid just to prove, and we had one bid for those services was $700,000 more. And to this day, the SU pays all of their bills from the SU, right, to meet the letter of the law, but the agency has allowed this to happen because we were able to prove that there's a diseconomy of scale. When you aggregate, you actually have to create more coordination. So you have to be concerned about what happens with district consolidation is that you will have bureaucracy that grows over time. And there are states like Arkansas, states like West Virginia that have been demonstrated this, right, that they've had this massive school closure initiative, school consolidation of district initiative. And then what happens is that they see bureaucracies grow over time, and the cost isn't necessarily materialized to the extent that it's promised. So that's really one of my concerns. Again, I think I talked about the idea of relational trust, right? People are skeptical of central office. And if you become very removed, think about, you had folks here from Essex County, Leominster, all the way down to Bradford in the region that I'm in. So sort of the collaborative supports that, but that's not a governance model. And I really think that it would really create a disconnect. And what we saw in some communities in Act 46, there's a lack of transparency, even though that was one of the goals of the law, because people don't understand a $50 million budget. They understand their local school budget, and they'll come out to town meeting, they'll look at their town report, they'll ask questions. But when you have a $50 million budget and there's 7 schools or 8 schools, they don't understand it, right? So I think that's a concern. There's not really been a full analysis of Act 46. I think that's something that if you're really going to make any changes around governance, that has to happen. That's something that I've encouraged. I serve on the Commission on the Future of Public Education along with Jeff, and that's something that I've asked for over and over. I know that's time consuming, but I think if we're going to move forward, we really need to analyze the most recent major change.
It's on our agenda, actually.
Okay, great. There's no evidence, right, that this is necessarily going to be more cost effective, right? There's no necessarily effective modeling. I would also put in a pitch. I know you'll hear different things from the Superintendent's Association. I talk to Chelsea about this all the time, but I would encourage you to invite in somebody like Elaine Collins, who's the current superintendent at North Country. And after 3 years, she's done cleaning up my mess and she can focus on things. But supervisory unions can work, right? They can be effective. They can be effective in administering quality, and they can work together. And again, it's this freedom and unity, right? It's balancing autonomy and agency at a local level, at the same time, sharing resources at a larger level. I am very concerned about the large district model, of course, because of increased choice and increased potential privatization. I think it's really predicated to close schools. And that's one of my primary concerns, is that you create a more disaffected group of governance body, and those people will have to make tough decisions if you put downward pressure on them, and small rural schools will close. And I'm not just talking about like my community that had 33 students. I'm talking about, schools that are 100 students or 80 students that are really viable still. I think there's sometimes a false perception around bureaucracy and the needs in central office. Some of those costs are administrative costs, but sometimes central office costs are things like special ed, right, that gets aggregated into that cost, or instructional coaches or therapeutic supports. And so I think you have to really parse out what expenses are we really identifying? Is it superintendents? Is it curriculum directors? Is it business managers? And the reality is some of those functions just need to happen, right? You need accounts payable, you need payroll. And so even if you have a larger footprint, I can tell you, people aren't sitting around in central offices looking for things to do, right? It was not uncommon that I would spend 70 to 75 hours a week trying to meet the needs of the SU, right? Because when you have 750 employees, right, and you have 20 direct reports, as I did, you have lots of things you have to deal with, right? And so to think that you're not going to have multiple layers of assistant superintendents, deputy superintendents, whatever they're called, you're going to have administrative layers in order to just meet the functions. And I worry if you don't, then you're not serving those communities, especially those outlying communities. I went to 15 to 16 school board meetings a month, right? And that's fine. And I supported that local democracy. Of course, that's not going to be necessary. You don't have boards, but you still need to have superintendent and central office staff getting out to your school communities to support them. And that wouldn't really happen. A couple more things and I'll wrap up. I think I already mentioned the idea of, we have a citizen legislature, we have public schools, and I really think that we have to look at board members as social capital, as ambassadors to our school communities. And I think sometimes we miss that, and sometimes it's perceived that board members are an impediment somehow to moving schools forward. And that's not necessarily the case. Yes, I probably dealt with some difficult board members, and they would probably say they dealt with some difficult superintendents, having dealt with me. But I really think local democracy and that sense of agency at the local level is important. And the last thing I would just put in another pitch for SUs. I do think they're still viable. And I know that's not always the case, where you'll hear from other folks that it feels like a challenge in managing multi-district supervisory. You have to manage boards. But if we believe in the sense of democracy, it's important. The last thing I would say, if we go back 15, 20 years ago, prior to Act 46, prior to I would say a diminishment of the agency, right? The agency had more capacity at one point. We had wonderful scores, right? Our NAEP scores were typically in the top 5 in the country. Now, I know our NAEP scores have come down, and I know we're thinking about what's the reason for that. Governance is not going to solve that, right? There are good schools in SUs, there are good schools in SDs, right? There are good big schools and there are good small schools. There are challenging big schools and challenging small schools. We need high quality teachers. I know I already talked about workforce earlier this spring, but we need a high quality workforce, right, in our schools, and we need the support of the agency. The agency needs to have the kind of capacity to support the field, not just with compliance, but with support around things like community schools that Jess would have done in her work, or around curriculum development and things like, talking about literacy, that those folks are gone, but they were talking about those needs. That is really how we improve our outcomes. It's really not about governance. It's not going to make a difference in outcomes. If anything, I think having people who make decisions about children's education closer to the children is going to ensure higher outcomes. I have more faith in that. There you go.
Thank you.
I don't know, we're going in a circle. First question is, when do you think that capacity was diminished at AOE?
Really started under the Douglas administration.
Okay.
It goes back that far. I'm not blaming, Governor Douglas, but there has been a slow decline in that capacity of the agency.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been rebuilt. I know the governor has proposed some additional funding for the future. Of course, we don't know what that $4 or $5 million is going to go to.
Right. So one of the things that Secretary Saunders continues to say, as I think a major imperative, I think she's resting a lot of her case on this, is that there's failing in central offices. There's so few staff to do the work that there's the capacity is almost at some dangerous level. I don't know. Well, someone else might do a better job of saying this than I am, but like critical failures.
When your goal
Yeah.
is to discredit, right, defund and dismantle public education, of course you're going to hear that, right? the agency is part of the system, right? And when the agency is focusing all of their efforts on a political push, right, for something and not supporting the field, I think we have to question that. The agency, I will certainly champion the need for capacity, and there's some really great rank and file people there, but if we're marshaling their time and energy to moving a political agenda forward and not serving the field, that's problematic. And so if SUs need support, where's the support? Everything can't be about compliance, right? And everything can't be about, accountability. Yes, there is a need for accountability, but the agency has no sense of advocacy. Nobody looks to the agency for support. That's the problem.
So,
Oh, can I ask one?
yeah.
I love these answers, by the way. They're really helpful, I think, and we need to hear from the field. I think we are definitely being asked to look at a foundation formula, right? So there's a lot of other governance questions that you focused on, et cetera. But if we are looking at a foundation formula, the first note I made was you saying that bureaucracy just tends to grow. And I do think Vermonters, whether it's accurate or not, want to make sure that a majority of the money they spend is going toward classroom activities related to student success. And I'd like to keep that, and I feel like I have a business manager person here, right? Or someone who's been an AOE grant. So in my head, I keep thinking about trying to separate out the functions in the foundation formula, like you were saying, special ed versus,
Well, special ed would be removed, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Which has its own problems, right?
Right.
73 promised a level of equity, right? And yet, based on a census block grant, is not equitable, right? Because we're basing it not on need.
Right.
We're basing it on numbers. And so when an SU like North Country loses a close to $1 million, right? And Champlain Valley is getting more money. When they have an IEP level, it's like 13% or 11 or 12, 13% versus like 23%. Makes no sense, right? And there's a provision in the law for a supplemental adjustment, section 11, right? It's still not being followed under the law. You might want to ask the secretary about that. All right. So there's an area where I think, we already have built-in inequity, right? And so, yes, that is separate from the foundation formula. I think we may want to look at more categorical aid, right? Because even the weighting in the foundation formula is no guarantee that weighting is going directing right to students of need.
Right.
Right.
That's right.
And so I understand that. And then this whole convoluted process, right, of the state guarantee, right, that we're going to somehow provide this ability to raise funds above the base amount, and that's really more simple than what we have, right? Isn't that what's being promoted? Right?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Right.
I think
Oh,
it's
right.
More
Yeah.
simple. I'm being
Yeah.
sarcastic.
I hear what
sorry.
you're saying. Yeah.
I know I shouldn't be in a Senate, hearing, but I really think it's problematic.
Yeah.
Because we are going to have multiple districts, or all districts are going to be asking above the base amount and the weighting, and that's going to be compounded problems.
Yes. And
Right.
it's going to be probably an
Yes, and I know with State Board Member Tammy Colby has provided some testimony in the House and has suggested a higher level, right, of the base amount. And if we move to that level, then we're actually potentially spending more money, right?
Right.
So I think what I understand today, and I don't have the details on this, but the purported 184 million
Yeah.
is really not going to materialize, right? There are other things that are going to eclipse that, whether it's universal meals or different things like that. And so I really worry about the data you're getting. And I think that's why we've given you a deep dive. I recognize you only got that yesterday. You don't have the time necessarily to have dug into that, but I really have to commend, Jess is the person who put that policy analysis together. We are not suggesting at this point recommendations to move forward. I'm happy to share my recommendation, but this is really to give you the full comprehensive understanding of why the governor's proposal is problematic at multiple levels. governance, finance, control, state board, all of those things. And I think there's a lot of data there that really can support that.
Senator Rushing. Wait.
Thank you. So in this document, page 33, 34, it describes the proposal as a hybrid voucher funded charter school model that is substantially more expensive and would cost taxpayers more. We've also heard the exact opposite of that. And so there's either a disagreement about definitions, or somebody's doing their math wrong, or there is, or somebody is just giving us incorrect information. And so we've heard the opposite. So can you present as to why you think this is correct?
I'll pose some possibilities, right? So one of the things that I think needs to be considered is when we're looking at the base amount, right, which was 13.2 or something like that, and there's weighting in there. Are independent schools accepting that, right? Are we basically saying to the independent schools, okay, here you go, you get the base amount? No, they're going to be expecting their $24,000, $25,000, I think. And so where's those funds coming? So if we have an increased choice, right, we are going to potentially be trying to respond to independent schools that are going to charge a tuition rate that is above the rate that the public schools are utilizing to meet their needs, right? I don't think that's been explained, right? I don't think anybody's shown a light on that yet. And I think that's partly problematic. And so that's something I would just bring to your attention right away. I don't know if Jess, if you have some thoughts that you would share.
Yeah, I
about
would.
that particular.
I think, and again, these are just 16
So,
assertions.
by the way, if you're going
Sure. I'm Jessica Careless. I am an independent contractor. I am a sole proprietor of public education consulting services. And some of you remember me. I was a division director at the Agency of Education who oversaw a fairly large portfolio of programs. And I would say that, when they bring up things like school choice, lottery systems, right? And this is what's being proposed as a fairly comprehensive statewide expansion of school choice, where then you're starting to look at geographic barriers, et cetera. That is the underpinning and the foundation of a voucher system, because what you're essentially saying is you're not bringing money into a system, because this is a pooled system right now, right, that we want to support. But instead, you're now creating a situation in which people enter into a lottery and they may or may not get the choice that shouldn't be a choice, because it should be a guarantee under our current Constitution. I think that there's a lot that can be said about it, and it's a much larger conversation, but I've included research around this where it shows that when you go to district-wide, because many states are much larger than Vermont, I think you've heard from some others who've testified where they oversaw districts that come close to the entire population of Vermont, right? But when you look at statewide scale or community-wide scale of school choice, what you often find is that you have increased costs. The other piece has to do with the governance, right? So when you start to bring in private entities, often they're for-profit private entities, even if they're nonprofit private entities that are now governing and making decisions about the administration of schools, that also causes increased costs, right? So again, we could do a whole session on that, and I'd be happy to dive into that. But really, this was just to say that there are these assertions being made as if it is true, and that this is a fait accompli. And that when you do a little bit deeper dive, what you're finding is that there's a lot of research. There's a lot of use of the evidence base, right? There are no evidence-based class size. That doesn't exist in the world. There has been research, certainly, right? But I think what we're trying to show is that this is very complex. There has been an urgency, and it has completely rallied everyone now who is now responding to a plan. And you cannot solve these problems with enormous complexity by moving this quickly and doing things like basing it on prototypical schools based on national models that haven't been applied, right? I think that there is a slowing down that really needs to happen to get our arms around it. You've just heard that today, which is, what do we do about the Northeast Kingdom? hold on to your hats because I know there's people in this room who love the TIF program. But in 2022, there was an evaluation of the TIF program. There were 10 learnings. There's 10 recommendations made. The last one, that 10th one, was we've got to do something about making sure this is available to rural communities. If you look at the districts that have been created, the majority of operating TIF districts are in that Champlain Valley district, right? So to what degree is this a chicken or egg? We expanded school choice in 2005 in the state exponentially. It was part of the State Board of Education strategic plan. It was public school choice. It's also, we are publicly funding private school choice. Without saying if it's good or bad, what we know is that costs have also increased. And as we have expanded, we now have 120 private schools. When we look at that, not only when we look at their school ratios, which are quite small, teacher to student ratios, we want to start saying what will be the impact of this move where we're only addressing one component of the system when we're trying to talk about cost. So I just think that this is saying we need to slow down. We need to dive into this a little bit more to make sure that in a system that since the last 5 years, a global pandemic, 2 major flooding events, one of those flooding events being multiple flooding events, right? We also changed our state summative assessment program. If you go back to 2015, we've also had consolidation. We had students this year start their school year in tents. When you are talking about this level of change, who is going to experience the consequence of that? It's going to be our students, right? Are we going to put them through a man-made disaster of this enormity without taking the time to really study it, leverage the Public Education Commission, do the work that we have already agreed to do, not have a 6-month plan based on contractors going around listening to some communities summarizing it for the secretary and then saying, we have the, that's the problem.
Thank you. Jeff Fennon.
Oh, are we done?
Thank you.
Or we have to move on? Okay, well, we should talk, and we should talk more about tips, because I think there is a way.
Thank you for having me. I
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Stick around, I maybe another question. Let's want to make sure we get through everybody.
Good afternoon. For the record, Jeff Bannon, Vermont Indiana Executive Director. My testimony will be brief compared to John's. I was told we had just a few minutes, and I will endeavor to do that, and happy to come back at any other time to dig in. I'll leave to John on the governance stuff. I think he did a nice job with that. I'll try to stay away from that. I will point out a few things that, with regard to the governance proposal from the governor, that's tongue twister. 2 years to change is too quick. I think Jeff has sort of alluded to that. 2 years to make such a sea change in governance and it's enormous. So I think it's way too quick to even imagine that's realistic. And secondly, I think our quality of our school system is very high, right? But in many measures, we're in the top 5, in some cases the top 3 of recent analysis. We are doing really well in the state of Vermont. Could we do better? Absolutely. Not questioning that. But we are doing really well by any measure nationally. And so I really bristle at the notion that we're not doing as well as we could, because certainly we can do better, but we are doing really well as compared to our other states. So I think that if you want to discredit public schools, you can do that and cherry pick this data point or that data point. But in the large, we are doing extremely well.
Can you elaborate on that just a little bit? Because we do hear that.
Yeah, and it's a narrative.
So I want you to use this opportunity well to
sure. So, for example, Wallet Hub. I'm not saying it's the most enlightened analysis, but recently it said we're top 3. Massachusetts, education states in the union.
And so, and based on what
their analysis, I'll let their analysis speak for itself, and I can dig into it later. Okay. But Massachusetts number 1, Maryland number 2, and Vermont number 3. So that's a recent report. The NAEP scores, for example, always used, and that's seen as John alluded to it again. The fact of the matter is, I didn't realize this until recently. Principals and superintendents do not get those results. So the NAEP score is tested. The results come back, but they don't come back to the school. So schools has no information about it, can't act on it, good, bad, or indifferent. It's largely a test that's designed to be extremely difficult, push kids and see where the weaknesses are. But it then doesn't do what you would think you would do, which is give the results back to the school and say, your kids are weak in this area, your kids are weak in that area. And you might want to change your practice up. That doesn't happen. That does not make any sense. It's meant to be sort of this national report card. It's been done for 25, 30 years, whatever it has been. And there's no reason to tailor it and improve it, because then the results are not linear. Right. So there's an incentive for them, whoever they may be, to keep this test as it is and keep it going as is with littlest change as possible. So I think that's the wrong measure.
But where do we fall on that chart?
Well, it depends. So they test in fourth grade reading and math, eighth grade reading and math. Our reading scores in fourth grade are not what they have been. They've been, they're dipping down. But the fact of the matter is, and I heard somebody say this, we kept our schools closed. So fourth graders today were, a few short years ago in the middle of the pandemic. We, as a matter of state, to keep people safe, and we had a very low death rate because of the pandemic, kept our schools closed a lot longer than other states did. So our kids they went through a remote environment or a different environment, learning environment than did other states. Those states may have done better. I don't know. But certainly we're suffering, if you will, the results of that. But we actually did a nice job of keeping people alive. And that was the priority of the state, from the governor on down, was keep people alive. And we did that, and we did that well. We should be proud of that. Will there be some consequences of that? Perhaps, and maybe this is it. But in eighth grade, our reading scores are back up, top 3 again in the country. So, we know how to manage and make sure the kids can read. And going even further about that, to your question about that, Raj Chetty, professor, former at Harvard, now at Stanford, he is an economist, and he's a big fan of saying we should be paying kindergarten teachers $360,000 a year, right? Vermont and the ICE supports that, right? You chuckle if I said otherwise. He also would say that we should make it easier to let go of teachers who are not, up to standards. And certainly what he also would say is that if you have people that you're paying $360,000 a year, you're going to attract a really good crop of people. They're going to want to stay, and they will stay. And so you'll have less problems, if you will, about that issue, about having to ask people to leave. The reality of what he's saying is we're testing the wrong thing. So the NAEP score and other tests are testing the wrong things. They're testing cognitive skills. And he says, if you just simply read and do math at a reasonably well level, you're fine. What we should be teaching and testing for are non-cognitive soft skills. If you want bang for the buck, teach that, test that, and that's where you will excel as a state. So I think that's what Raj Chetty has been pushing for some time. Pretty good guy. I don't know him, but certainly his research is well founded. And I think that's where we got to be headed. We got to be asking, why is it we're testing about? Why are we relying on NAEP, and why are we looking at that? Is that really the right measure? And I think here we have somebody saying, no, it's not. It's entirely the wrong measure.
So we got a little, I got us a little sidetracked.
That's fine.
You were in the middle of.
No, that's fine. I think it's interesting, truthfully. And as somebody with Irish descent, we're coming up on St. Patrick's Day, I would say the Irish did this some 30, 40, 50 years ago. They realized the only asset they had were people. And they invested a heck of a lot into their education system. And it's paying off. And, there are ups and downs in the Irish economy, but overall, their people are well educated, incredibly literate, and accomplished, and they attract the best and brightest companies to come to Ireland to settle. And so that's worked out well for them. And I think we could model that. We are a very bright state. We're well educated. And I think we should count that as a virtue and really try to attract businesses and families to come to Vermont on that basis and not denigrate the public school system, which is really darn good, in my humble opinion. So I'll say that. There was some discussion about the AOE support, and that was actually the challenge for change in the recession of 2007, 2008, when the agency was cut. They have not come back. I believe they lost 50 positions back then. We've never recovered from that. And it shows. I remember sitting in this committee a long time ago where there was a special ed group at the then DOE where they came in and they took 10 schools and piloted them and worked with them very intensely about their special ed and how they did it and how they did it well and how they could improve. That doesn't happen anymore, and it should. So I think that's a real challenge, if you will, to improve the capacity of the AOE to assist the field. And Chelsea Myers has talked about the data points they needed in December to make their budgets. They didn't get. They got it very late and in some cases not accurately. So they knew that at the agency at the time, but they're pushing other things. I don't know what, but they weren't giving the field what they needed to establish budgets in preparation for town meeting day. And that's a problem. And that should be rectified. Finally, with regard to the foundation formula, Vermont NEA is not a knee-jerk no to that. We're intrigued by it, and there may be some virtue in it. So I know that Tammy Colby has spoken to some other committees. She's on the State Board of Education, but she's also a former UVMer, academic professor, and she's with AIR now. I don't know what that stands for. And her number is 15,500 plus weights. The governor's proposal is 13,200 plus weights. As John alluded to, if you go to the 15.5, which maybe the more accurate Vermont contextualized number, we actually may spend more. So the question is whether we're spending adequately or not. I think Tammy Colby's number would say we're not. We should really examine that, and maybe that's a better way to go. So we're not a knee-jerk no to the foundation formula. I think there's a lot of consternation, question marks about how. It was just in Senate Finance. There's a lot of questions about how they arrived at that number. And so I think there's a lot more discussion about that number. That we want to remain engaged in that conversation. And perhaps you can have Tammy Colby come in and talk about how she did. One other thing about regard to Act 173, the special education block grant funding system. We're running two systems, right? The public school system is receiving the block grant, but when a Holland, for example, and or some other town that does not operate a school has a special needs child on an IEP, and they go to a private school,
Independent
school, private school, whatever.
Okay.
It could be one of the 4 historic academies. Yeah. It doesn't matter. They're on a reimbursement model, the old-fashioned way. So the school district, the sending district, the LEA, local education agency, is sending the private or independent school, whatever name you want to label to it, on a reimbursement dollar for dollar model. So the incentive for the private school is maybe not the incentive, but the reality is they get paid for every dollar they spend on behalf of that child. Versus the public school, if they were sending it to if they were an operating district, they would get a block grant for that child. And they would have to operate within that confines of that block grant. So we're running two different financial systems on special ed for a lot of kids. That ought to be examined. I know the advisory group on which I sat in the 173 advisory group looked at that, tried to push for that. It didn't happen. We think that should be re-examined. In addition, Tammy Colby talks about a foundation formula. You typically don't have block grants. You would have that built into the formula, and you can talk with her about that and get the details of that. But she will, I think she said this in Ways and Means last week. The better way that other states do it under a foundation formula is you build in the special ed as a weight per child. That's how they do it. We don't have a foundation formula, so we did a different thing. But if you're changing things, you might want to look at changing that at the same time. And lastly, with regard to the foundation formula, any formula of that sort, there's got to be an inflator that has meat and teeth to it, that does not bite the students or the schools because they don't have a decision in whether it's increases or doesn't. But for example, in Colorado, where APA, the consultant that the governor's using, they said that they were $2 billion in the short. In other words, they have an inflator. They know how much it should be, but the state had shorted it $2 billion. And I don't know what their total education spending is, and it's probably a whole lot more than ours, and I guarantee that it is. But when you start, $2 billion is a lot of money in any bank account, and certainly I assume it is in Colorado. And that means their schools are getting less money than they were otherwise supposed to. And where that comes out is it comes out in programs that losses for kids. And that should not happen. If the adults make a decision, the kids shouldn't suffer. And so we think there should be a realistic inflator and some mechanism in it that it should not, if it's not fully funded by the state, the schools and the programs for the kids don't suffer.
Okay, so you kind of threw a new term into the mix here. That's inflator. What is it? How does it affect? You got to give us some context.
Sure.
Because it kind of threw the train off the tracks right at that point.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to. So most foundation formulas have some sort of inflation device attached to it. So the governor's proposal is 13,200. And we know that might be this year, but next year there might be 3,300. I don't know. Something, something different based on just simple inflation. So everything goes up. And so most formulas have some sort of inflation device attached to it. Of course, most states.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yes, it's all, it's an
I
inflation.
had no idea what you were.
I'm sorry.
What you were alluding to.
Yes, we think that the formula, yes, there's no talk about it. And, so I'm looking at all these, the 4 or 5 documents from the governor's office on their proposal. What you all need is a bill. That's how you operate. Legislation is usually in the form of a bill. We haven't seen a bill yet. They may put an inflation device in there into their foundation formula. I don't know. I've not heard that. I've seen it in any of their paper, in their narrative. But I think that we just want to raise it. You got to have it in there.
Got it. Thank you. Bills? What?
No, I'm sure not. Okay.
I can imagine a scenario in which we choose the higher per pupil amount, but then much more
Choose a higher.
choose a higher foundation
higher,
formula per
I'm sorry.
pupil amount, choose a higher amount, but then maybe significantly limit local ability to spend on top of that. I'm just curious how you think if you support a version of the foundation formula or you're open to it, how we don't rebake in inequity.
Yeah. I think what you're driving is Brigham.
I'm driving at Brigham, and I'm also driving at the fact that one of the biggest allures of the foundation formula for people is that they want something that they can understand when they go to vote on anything, when they go to pay their property taxes. But that we've always said that simplicity is hard to achieve while you're also seeking equity.
Right. I mean, that is true. And so, I'm not sure what your question is, but I know that, the question of Brigham is real. I know that some have raised questions about it, and I think you should probably hear from some lawyers who are better schooled in this area than am I. The question is, if you have an adequate amount and somebody wants to spend more than that, should they be prohibited? If they are allowed to spend more, should there be a penalty for that? I mean, we've heard discussion of perhaps a double tax above the amount that's granted by the formula. So, and there is a fair amount of inequity in the current funding system.
Right.
There's a fair disparity, and that's the question.
Yeah. I guess what you said made me think maybe we shouldn't just maybe if we let people add on their own amount on top, it would just create inequity again, and we should just have a foundation formula that we feel pretty good about from the start.
Yeah, you need to make sure that it's adequate, right? I mean, that's the question. And then voters need to be allowed to, in some way, speak up in favor of something else. I think, and I don't know how, that's probably in GovOps, Dunmall, where they're going to take up voting and that. So there's a lot of moving parts. When you take the system that we have now and completely upend it, there's a lot of questions that go along. And I think one of them is equity and how we maintain it. Because right now we have an equitable funding system. Everybody raises the same amount and spends, but doesn't necessarily spend that same amount. And that's a locally derived decision. But everybody raises the same way, whether you spend it in Burlington or raise it in Burlington versus Bennington. It's raised the same way in a fair way. This would be a little bit different because above the adequate amount, if you will, the formula amount, you may be. I guess the issue is if it's taxed the same in Bennington or Burlington, it would be equitable. Perhaps they can decide whether to do that. That's a different question.
Did I miss testimony from a state like Massachusetts to just hear how they do things?
No. Didn't listen.
Okay. I mean, I did see the wallet hub thing. Yeah. And I just think wherever you look at these, to me, it's more impressive to look at states that are extremely diverse and still have higher scores than we do, like Massachusetts and Maryland. So I just, if as we look to jump to something we say is so common in every other state where they have better outcomes than we do, I hope we could look at, like, talk to some of those business managers or something in those states about how they do things.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting to see how Maryland, Massachusetts, any other M states.
We were third most educated based on how many people have 95% high school diploma and 43% have a bachelor's degree.
Right.
So it's-
Yes, I mean, that's a different question too. We have one of the highest graduation rates in the country for high school and one of the lowest high school or college matriculation rates.
Mhm.
We also support higher ed lower than just about any other state in the union.
Mhm.
I mean, is that
Right.
accurate?
I think we just have a huge delta, but that's because we have a very high high school graduation rate. I don't think that means we have a very low college graduation.
Yeah, I mean, you
rate.
could argue both ways, right?
Comparison to the,
Yes,
yeah,
I understand that. We also support higher ed at a very low rate, make it perhaps difficult for people.
listen, I
Yeah.
agree with you there.
Thank you. Oh, you had a question?
Just where's that data come from on the students you're pulling from? You said the first one, that were number 3. That data comes from which?
It was Wallet Hub,
Wallet.
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 I believe it's in, well, it's,
I just Googled it.
yeah, it's a, I can share it with you.
5 different answers. Okay,
Yeah, there are any number of ways to slice data. And they look at it,
understand it.
as Senator Ron Hinsdale said, as high school graduation rate and college. So we're the smartest, the third smartest, is how they count it. Does it mean that's 100% accurate? No. It just means that by their measures, we're top 3. We do really well. An example on the reading score and NAEP scores in 8th grade, we're top 3 there. Years ago, and I haven't seen any numbers in a long time ago, the PISA, the international PISA test, if we had been a country, would have been a top 10 country in the world on the PISA test. So that was an international exam. So there are any number of exams you can look at, and we do, I think overall we do really well. We graduate a lot of kids, but we could do better. No question about it. Always could do better.
Go ahead. One more question.
Is it a requirement for schools to do the NAEP test or is it optional?
Is not optional. I don't know.
They get chosen
Yeah, I think that it's
by the federal government.
not every school takes.
So that's why we don't get to that. So could we get it if we want to ask
It's,
for it?
you can access summaries on page 27, I think.
Okay.
of that.
Yeah, if I can, correct me if I'm wrong, Jessica. I think that the reason why NAEPs aren't distributed down to the school level or the district level is the schools are so small. It's like personally protected information. You can tell that out of those 17 graduates, this is these are their test scores. That's the problem.
Yeah, and they're not tracking necessarily individual students, right?
They're not, that's
Or the
not.
national assessment of how education is doing.
It's not designed to help students or
Yeah.
teachers
It's
improve
to
their practice.
evaluate the system.
Correct. It just takes a look at the system.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Look forward to conversing some more.
Yeah. Oliver Olson.
Great, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. For the record, Oliver Olson, here on behalf of the Vermont Independent Schools Association. So first, I think it's really important to just recognize the magnitude of the challenges that are facing our state. If we had a blank sheet of paper, we would never design the system that we have today. I think practically everybody would agree with that. So we're in need for big new ideas. I think we also need to recognize that big new ideas never make it to the finish line without a lot of input and a lot of change along the way. And the reality is we don't have a blank sheet of paper. We have a very complex system that serves some diverse needs that we have across the state. There's no doubt that there's certainly opportunity for some level of simplification in our governance system. And any meaningful change to our financing system is really dependent on bringing a little bit more coherence to our governance system. That being said, we obviously, we don't have a bill yet. So, my comments on behalf of the association are really based on what we've read in the various policy papers and some of the testimony that's been given. And I would say that the association is very concerned with, while we certainly see merit and we see promise in some aspects of the proposal, we certainly have concern about any construct that puts independent schools in the same school district as public schools. That's just something we do not support. We think it's going to lead to a lot of challenges and a lot of problems. We have a system today, as you know, where we have school districts that operate public schools for some or all grades, and we have school districts that do not operate, the so-called non-operating districts that do not operate public schools for some or all grades. And when you look at a map of Vermont, as I presented to you a few weeks ago, roughly 30% of Vermont's landmass is covered by these non-operating districts. And when you look at the geography of those districts and the demographics, you're going to see that, what they have in common is, by and large, they're sparsely populated. And that's the reason why public school infrastructure wasn't built there. And over time, in not all communities, and I'll come back to this, but in many communities, independent schools really kind of filled that gap. And our members certainly see their role as continuing to play that historic role in providing great educational opportunities for kids in rural areas of Vermont. Our members have no interest in, sort of expanding out into areas where there's already robust public education infrastructure. I think there's a narrative out there that sort of, suggests that, that this bill is, laying the foundation for, some sort of privatization of our education system. We certainly don't see it that way. We certainly wouldn't support that. And I think if you look through the details of some of the policy proposals and you play it out, you can see that that's just not the way that would work. So, a few things I did want to respond to. There was a comment that we have 122 independent schools and that there's been growth and there's talk about for-profit schools. So I just want to clear the air on a few things. As a reminder, and I think you all know this, as a matter of law, the approval of any new independent school is prohibited. There is no legal mechanism.
Taking tuition.
Pardon me?
Tuitions.
Approved independent schools, period.
Yes.
You cannot, there is no mechanism to approve any new independent schools. And while there's a narrative out there that somehow there's been this growth of independent schools, the data does not support that. Between 2004 and last year, there was actually a net reduction in the number of independent schools. So not only is there no legal mechanism to create new approved independent schools, there's actually been a net reduction in independent schools. And every independent school that is approved for public tuition in Vermont is a nonprofit entity. So I think there's sort of a boogeyman out there that I think we need to deconstruct and kind of stick with the facts. So as we think about these rural areas, and that's really what we're talking about here, where we have these non-operating districts, there are essentially three major pockets of them that are supported by independent schools across the state. So it's up in the Northeast Kingdom, kind of up at the White River Valley area, and down in the sort of Bennington area. And there's a cluster of these non-operating districts where high percentage of students are attending independent schools because there is no public school infrastructure. So back to to John's point about the role of supervisory unions, we do see that there is a in any sort of consolidation of governance and rationalization of our governance structures, we do see a possible role for a supervisory union construct or something similar to it, to really sort of accommodate the geographic realities that we see in some of these rural areas that have been served served well by independent schools that have been constructed without any state capital construction aid. And as a reminder, the state's facing a, $6 billion, worth of deferred maintenance in the public, school fleet. We don't think this is the time to add to that challenge. So essentially, what our position is, we feel very strongly that we need to find a way to sort of, address the needs of these local communities, not create a structure where you're putting independent schools and public schools in the same governance unit. We're really concerned that it's going to be the similar in some respects to John's comments. We definitely have some concerns that it's the rural communities and that design paradigm that are going to come out not well in that. And I sort of liken it to it's almost like a public utility where you have a public utility that's given a franchise for a service territory. And now you're saying, if you want, and it's at your discretion, you can grant authority for some other utility to come into your service territory. I'm not sure why a public utility would agree to do that. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And as I'm going through and sort of playing out the bill, it's important to keep in mind that these regional boards that will be, I think, by a function of, one person, one vote, are going to have a lot of representation from more populated areas that have that public school infrastructure. I'm not sure what the incentive would be to be authorizing, the creation of any new schools in that system, let alone, so anyway, I'll leave it at that. Happy to answer any questions.
Senator Bishop.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I just want to preface, I do see the value in some private schools in different areas, filling a need that is not filled by public institutions. I see that we have a complicated system, and in certain areas there's a need. But the only thing that I take issue with is the characterization of the nonprofit entity. And I mean, I know that technically they are nonprofits, but I mean, Blue Cross Blue Shield is a nonprofit. They rake in millions of dollars, if not billions, in profit each year. I mean, there are, it's a tax designation that provides tax benefits for that entity. And there are private school principals making over $250,000 a year. So it's, characterizing them as nonprofits where I understand that's the technical and legal designation that they have, but, as if they're running a charity, it doesn't quite square up. I do also know, I'll acknowledge there's definitely schools that are running tight margins as well, private schools that are running tight margins. I don't contest that, but I just wanted to express that. So in response, I would say that, by and large, these schools are running extremely tight margins, and, year over year, to the extent that there's a surplus that, basically brings down the operating costs the following year. Not unlike, other organizations. There aren't shareholders, who are receiving, dividends, dividend income. These are nonprofit institutions that are, governed by, a board of trustees, not unlike any other nonprofit.
Yeah, I'd like to, if I can, just count for a sec. My colleague, Hunzer, said comments about nonprofits. So in one of my masters, I studied nonprofits pretty intensely. And the criticisms that you just levied on a particular segment of nonprofits apply to probably the majority of the 6,000 nonprofits that are in Vermont. They can all benefit the same way that any other nonprofit can benefit in the way that you outlined it. So I'm not sure that's a fair criticism for an education nonprofit versus a climate nonprofit or some other entity within the state.
I don't fully understand.
I'm just going to leave it there. It's the criticism of a nonprofit that you levied it's not nonprofits are nonprofits. They operate by the same set of rules. It's an education nonprofit versus another nonprofit from another genre. It's the same criticism. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, what if we want to get, I'm going to say that, using Bornberg as an example, the Bornberg raises $2 million a year. So basically the first $2 million a year to the communities is free. And part of that is the job of the head of that's the large part of the job of the head of school. So the salary is somewhat commensurate with the responsibility of you could make the argument.
And again, the other thing that's really unique about, Vermont's independent schools is, and it's, I think, really critical in this time period when, we're facing this huge, liability across the state, $6 billion worth of public infrastructure needs. That's, all of that infrastructure was, constructed without any state capital construction aid.
Any more questions? Otherwise, we have a full afternoon. Yes.
This is just for my own education on the committee, because this will continue to come out. Can you just, from the time on the Board of Education, when you all may have set some standards about what a school has to commit to, so they're considered non-discriminatory?
Yes.
Does that exist in a document? You can email me.
That exists in the.
That's less than 100 pages.
Well, ironically, if you look at so that exists within Rule Series 2200, which are the schools that govern the approval of independent schools. And it's, that went through a few substantial rewrites, and part of those revisions over the past few years really strengthened and bolstered existing non-discrimination requirements that are already in statute, and really carried them forward into the rules. And additionally, now the rules require an annual attestation by the head of school compliance with those rules.
And they have to meet those rules to receive public dollars.
Absolutely.
They can exist and discriminate if they are not receiving tuition dollars.
That would be a legal question. I want to be careful on that, because on some of these you start getting into some First Amendment issues. But the rules as they exist today for schools that accept publicly funded students, you need to comply with Vermont's anti-discrimination laws. And I would say that our association, as a condition of membership, all of our members have to basically commit to those standards and more as well.
What did you think of the testimony about a reimbursement system for special ed versus a block grant? If we were to move to one system, do you want to speak to that? Do you see it the same way?
I think it's a little bit more complicated. I think one of the challenges that I see in these conversations is that we're comparing a public education LEA with an independent school. And there are two different constructs, right? So you have, within a public school system, within the school district, right?
Yeah.
So there are things that are held at the district, things that are held at the SU.
Right.
And we tend to get, like special ed is a great example. There's this notion that, well, every public school serves every student with every special education needs.
Right.
That's not strictly true. If the LEA has that responsibility, and sometimes, in some cases, if that particular public school isn't the best environment for that student, right? The responsibility doesn't live with the school, but it's at the LEA. So that's why I think some of these things we have to be a little bit careful trying to compare an independent school with, say, an LEA.
Yeah, I wonder if there's any value trying to compare which system has spent more per student.
So, one thing that's it is a little bit of apples and oranges, but you can look at the equalized per pupil spending of some of these districts that have that are largely certified independent schools, compare that against the state average. So for example, the district that I live in, the Taconic and Green Regional District, is, I think, perhaps might be the number one district in the state in terms of the number of students who are tuition in independent schools. The next two would be Kingdom East up in the Northeast Kingdom and St. Johnsbury School District. And I might have the order wrong, but if you look at the cost per student on an equalizer, now the long-term weighted average ADM basis compared to the state average, it's pretty much at the average.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, what time are we on tomorrow?
One.
Actually, I tried for.
Yeah, or 1:30.
No, it's one o'clock.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.